The very first video that I did on this channel covered the somewhat deranged-looking Blumenvoss BV-141. That was a prototype reconnaissance aircraft that was built for the Luftwaffe. Now, recon planes need good visibility, and with this, it was achieved in classic Blum and Voss fashion. However, the design was eventually rejected for being too outlandish, and there were production concerns over its complex construction requirements. Instead, the Luftwaffe went with this, the Focke Wulf 189. This is probably the best German aircraft that you've never heard of. It entered service in the middle of the Second World War, and it mostly saw service on the Eastern Front. Now, at first glance, it looks completely unsuitable for service on the Eastern Front. It looks dainty, fragile, and the engines appear to be quite small and clearly underpowered. But looks can be deceiving. The 189 quickly earned a good reputation for itself. It was easy to fly, stable in bad weather, a not uncommon occurrence on the Eastern Front, and it was durable. It was able to take a lot of damage, and it could fly comfortably and stably on just the one engine. It was loved by its crews, and it was respected by its enemies. Indeed, Captain Erich Winkel-Braun, one of the world's most prolific test pilots, claimed that it was one of the best handling aircraft he'd ever flown, and praise really doesn't get much higher than that. Unfortunately, the success, and therefore the fame, of the Focke Wulf 189 was limited by its delayed entry into service. It was a classic case of innovation versus conservatism, and it was one hell of a blunder for the Luftwaffe. But I am getting a bit ahead of myself here. Before we talk about the high command decisions that make you go, why, we need to start at the beginning. Hi, Editing Room Rex here. Just a quick interruption. When I recorded this video several weeks ago, I didn't realise at the time, but I was coming down with a very nasty head cold. And going back over the original studio footage, I realised I looked like crap. So for this video there is going to be no studio footage, and as the video progresses you might notice my voice changes a little bit, but I think it's not too bad that I had to re-record the whole thing. But I apologise in advance if I don't sound my usual bright self as I talk about the history of the Focke Wulf 189, because the flu was bearing down on me at the time. Anyway, let's continue. In the first half of the Second World War, the Luftwaffe largely served as a tactical support force for the Wehrmacht. In this, the historical spotlight normally falls on things like close air support aircraft such as the Junkers 87, or the tactical bombers like the Dornier 17. But the role of battlefield reconnaissance cannot be overstated. Reconnaissance planes were a vital tool for the army. They're a tool that's been around since the dawn of aerial warfare. Indeed, the first official military aircraft were observation balloons, which were essentially a tethered form of reconnaissance aircraft. If used correctly, they can provide the army with excellent tactical flexibility. They can locate enemy positions beyond the army's standard line of sight, they can warn of incoming attacks or counterattacks, and they can help to correct the direction of artillery fire. Now, before the Second World War, in the mid-1930s, this role was being filled for the Luftwaffe by the Heinkel HE-46. This aircraft was of a simple design. It was an open-cockpit, high-wing monoplane, but it was very popular because it could be manufactured quickly. This helped the Luftwaffe rapidly expand its number of tactical reconnaissance units, and it also provided them with a stable training platform. But this design was quickly showing its age. It was not only technologically crude, but it had the same chances of surviving a modern battlefield as the French government had for a stable term in office, which for the 1930s was basically zero. It was replaced by the Henschel HS-126. Now, this was an excellent design, and it was built on the strengths of its predecessor, but also sought to eliminate its weaknesses. It now featured an enclosed cockpit, a reliable 9-cylinder radial engine, a 3-blade variable pitch propeller, and it featured many stamped or pressed aluminium parts which allowed for easy mass production. However, aviation technology was developing so quickly in the 1930s that some officers within the Luftwaffe were worried that it would become obsolete pretty much as soon as it entered service. These concerns were highlighted when some of the HS-126s got involved during the Spanish Civil War. There, its modest performance and minimal defences made it a relatively easy target for Republican fighters. But the main problem that was observed was the fact that the observer had to operate the defensive machine gun. This meant that if the observation aircraft came under attack, it could no longer perform its primary function because the observer was too busy handling a machine gun, and this wasn't exactly ideal. This drawback had, admittedly, already been pointed out by aircrews during its initial service testing, and in February of 1937, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium issued a specification for a potential replacement. This would be a new aircraft with a crew of 3, which would allow for a dedicated rear gunner. It was to have better overall performance than the Henschel 126, and superior all-around visibility, as the more you can see, the more useful your observation aircraft will be. Additionally, it was to have a more powerful engine to allow for a small tactical bomb load of 200 to 300 kilograms of light bombs. This would allow for attacks of opportunity against undefended soft targets that the aircraft might stumble upon. 3 manufacturers would eventually submit designs to this specification: Arado, Blohm + Voss, and Focke Wulf. All of them took a unique approach to designing a tactical reconnaissance aircraft, and some of them had aesthetics which might only appeal to the medically blind. But if we had to pick one, it would be Arado's design, the AR-198, that was by far the most conservative. This was a shoulder-wing monoplane that was powered by a radial engine. It featured a heavily glazed fuselage for better visibility, and this included a belly compartment for the observer. Despite looking a bit like a pregnant seagull, it was considered by the Luftwaffe to be the safe choice. As such, Arado was awarded a contract to produce a prototype. However, later on in the testing phase, the design showed very poor handling and it was ultimately rejected. The next design in the list was the Blohm + Voss BV-141, which serves as a visual metaphor for the company's bold tradition of not only thinking outside the box, but taking the box, throwing it out the window, and replacing it with a tesseract. Now, despite some early development problems, this highly asymmetric aircraft possessed some astounding characteristics. It had very good performance for its size, and its off-center crew compartment offered some excellent visibility from the point of view of being a reconnaissance aircraft. However, as I mentioned at the start of this video, many thought that the design was too risky, and there were concerns it would be difficult to manufacture quickly and in quantity. Because of this, the design was rejected, but Blohm + Voss was stubborn, and they continued development at their own expense. Although approximately 28 BV-141s would eventually be built and some entered pre-service use, they never won over the confidence of their critics. That just left Focke Wulf's design, which was overseen by chief designer Kurt Tank. He took a different approach. Although the specification implied that a single-engine aircraft was desired, it was never outright stated as such. Because of this, Kurt Tank chose to go with a twin-engine design instead. This provided multiple benefits. It was easier to meet performance targets. 2 engines meant more redundancy, so if one engine failed or was damaged, it could still fly using the other, and it allowed for a twin-boom design, something that Kurt Tank considered ideal for a reconnaissance aircraft. This was because it allowed a crew compartment to be installed within a highly glazed central nacelle, or a gondola. This offered excellent visibility because there would be no engine in front of the crew cabin and no tail section behind it. Like the BV-141, this would give unimpeded views, while, unlike the BV-141, still looking like something vaguely grounded in reality. The crew sat at 3 per the specification. There was a pilot, an observer/wireless operator, and a rear gunner who was also often a qualified mechanic. From the outset, the gondola would be designed to be interchangeable to fulfill different roles. It was fixed to the 3-spar wing by special mountings, with the central spar running right through it. Apart from offering great visibility, it also helped to improve the design streamlining, because it possessed a stepless cockpit, meaning that there was no break in the nose contour, and the tapered end section of the gondola allowed for a relatively clean exiting airflow. Despite looking simpler and sleeker, this design was treated with a similar amount of reserve to that of the BV-141. However, a prototype was still ordered in April 1937, and this order was soon expanded, as Luftwaffe prototype developments often did, to include several more. The construction of the prototype was remarkably rapid, with the detailed design work and assembly being completed within 15 months of the contract being signed. In pursuit of reliability, the design would make use of the new Argus 410 engine. This was an air-cooled inverted V12 which produced approximately 465 horsepower. It was not yet in production, but pre-production test models were used on the first prototype, the Focke Wulf 189 V1. This would take to the skies for the first time in July of 1938, with Kurt Tank himself at the controls. He was something of a prolific test pilot, which no doubt caused a bit of anxiety for his colleagues, considering the pressures they were under to supply equipment to the hastily arming and expanding Luftwaffe, but thankfully for all concerned, the flight characteristics of the prototype were more than adequate. By August, a second prototype, the V2, joined the first in the test program, and it was joined by the third prototype the following month. The V2 was almost identical to the V1, the only real difference being that it came with its armament. This consisted of 3 7.9mm MG-15 machine guns, 1 forward firing in the nose, 1 rear firing in a dorsal position, and 1 in the tail gun. These were to be operated by the gunner and the observer as needed. Meanwhile, the pilot would make use of 2 additional 7.9mm MG-17s that were installed in the wing roots. The third prototype, again, was almost identical, but its main goal was not armament trials but power plant refinement. It featured production versions of the Argus 410 engine, as well as the newly developed and Argus-built variable pitch propellers. With the disappointing results of the Arado 198 and the continued distrust of the unique-looking BV-141, the poor thing, the RLM would award a contract for a further 4 prototypes for the Focke Wulf 189 in short order. The first, V4, would match the planned production series that was to be designated the Focke Wulf 189A Uhu, meaning owl in German. Although the Uhu was its official name, it was commonly referred to as Das Fliegende Auge, or the Flying Eye, which was a more fitting, if slightly less whimsical title. Anyway, nomenclature aside and getting back to the prototype, there were only a few changes to the V4 itself. The engine cowlings were modified, the main wheels received a partial covering, and the tail wheel was slightly enlarged. The defensive armament was reduced, though, to only a pair of MG-15s on flexible mounts. Possibly as a weight-saving measure, it's not exactly well explained. V4's main role would be to trial various special equipment options that were being considered for the production versions of the 189. Notably, this included the Type S-125 smokescreen dispenser, which was excellent in giving further utility in supporting ground troops, as well as trials of spray containers for the Yellow Cross family of mustard gas. Thankfully, though, the latter would not be used in combat. The next prototype, the V5, was to be the model for the Focke Wulf 189B trainer series, and as such it stands out as one of the more unique of the prototype series. This wasn't a training aircraft for crews that were converting to the 189 from the single-engine HS-126, though that would be a benefit. Instead, the primary role of the 189B
would be for night fighter training and wireless operator training. For this role, its crew gondola was completely redesigned. Instead of the distinctive reconnaissance nacelle, this was given a shape much closer to that of a conventional aircraft. The V5 was fitted with dual controls, and its cockpit could now accommodate up to 5 people. It made its first flight in early 1939. At around the same time as this, the first prototype, the V1, was removed from the testing program and heavily modified to apply for another military contract. This specification called for a dedicated close support aircraft. The glazed nacelle was replaced with a heavily armoured, vaguely aerodynamic, and horrifically cramped cockpit for the proposed Focke Wulf 189C. The result looked like a Focke Wulf 189 after it had come out of a very cold shower and then been punched in the face. It was now designated as the Focke Wulf 189 V1B, and it would compete against the prototype of the Henschel HS-129, which we covered in a video several months ago. The aircraft was submitted for testing in the spring of 1939, and the results were not especially encouraging. The heavy armoured cockpit seriously harmed both performance and handling, and visibility was so bad that the crew might as well have been wearing blindfolds. During testing, which involved some mock combat operations, the rear gunner was unable to spot a fighter approaching from behind until it was so close to the prototype that an attack by boarding might have been more sensible. In response, the glazed area of the cockpit was enlarged, and the gunner's small porthole was replaced with a slightly larger opening. These changes improved visibility to a more acceptable level, though it still remained less than ideal, and there were other problems to be fixed as well. Even though the Focke Wulf 189 V1B and the Henschel 129 prototypes went through numerous modifications, the competition failed to produce a clear winner. Both types showed rather mediocre performance and handling, and both were showing an alarming tendency of trying to kill their pilots through the deprivation of spatial awareness. Matters came to an unfortunate end for the V1B during demonstration flights at Bremen, when the pilot, still suffering from poor visibility, almost crashed into a hangar. In avoiding it, he lost control and the prototype came down in a wheels-up landing, injuring the pilot and writing off the aircraft. The V6 prototype was then reallocated as a replacement, and it was completed with heavier armament, which consisted of 2 20mm cannons and 4 forward-firing 7.9mm machine guns to complement them. However, as we saw in the HS-129 video, both designs gave poor performance and handling, but as the 129 was substantially smaller and cheaper to manufacture, it was grudgingly awarded the contract. As such, further work on the Focke Wulf 189C prototype was abandoned. The final prototype in the initial order was for the V7. Now, this was a proposed seaplane conversion. There is basically zero information or photographs on this. Apparently, it was similar to the V5 trainer in shape, and the V7 would have been fitted with 2 large floats. This prototype appears to have never been completed, as interest in the project was lost rather quickly for one reason or another. However, with the exception of the ill-fated competitor to the Henschel 129, the Focke Wulf 189 prototypes that were completed enjoyed a mostly trouble-free life. They also informed the Luftwaffe that its decision to back Focke Wulf over its competitors had been the correct choice. As a result, by the middle of 1939, the engineering team at Focke Wulf and the workers in its factories were preparing to provide the Luftwaffe with a new generation of tactical reconnaissance plane. Unfortunately for them, though, the Luftwaffe was just about to have a change of heart. Although the V1, V2, and V3 prototypes had performed well in their evaluations, the type was rather slow to enter production. Senior officials within the Luftwaffe had opted to keep the Henschel 126, the aircraft the Focke Wulf 189 was meant to replace, in service for longer. and some were now calling for the Focke Wulf aircraft to supplement it rather than outright replace it. The reasoning behind this decision is not crystal clear. Some sources indicate skepticism about the new and innovative design, leading to a more cautious procurement process. Other sources point to the short takeoff and landing capabilities of the Henschel, which were excellent, making it more suitable for rough field conditions. And many sources suggest it was the simple logic of sunk cost fallacy. The Henschel was still relatively new, and it had already been built in large numbers, so it would be a bit of a waste of resources to try and replace it so hastily. Whatever the reasons, the outcome was of course the same, a very sluggish start to production, and one that the Luftwaffe would eventually come to regret. Indeed, the reconnaissance version of the Focke Wulf 189 was given such low priority in the summer of 1939, on the eve of war, that the first production models to be completed would be for the dual-control trainer variant. 3 pre-production Focke Wulf 189 B0s were completed in the latter half of 1939, followed by 10 B1 production models, the last being delivered in February of 1940. As the war quickly expanded in scope, no further orders were placed for the B-series as the Luftwaffe was reconsolidating its production requirements. After testing at Rechlin, the aircraft were transferred to operational units, and there they were used not only for crew training, but also as liaison, transport, and general utility aircraft. Production of the tactical reconnaissance variant would finally start in the spring of 1940, but even then the Luftwaffe didn't exactly pursue this with much zeal. Its initial order was modest, just 10 pre-production models designated the 189A0, followed by only 20 production versions of the A1. That cautious approach reflected the Luftwaffe's continued faith in the older Henschel 126, which was by then serving in more than 30 observation squadrons. Now, given the course of the war up to this point, that confidence was, at least from their perspective, not entirely unreasonable. The Luftwaffe had been enjoying great success, but that was soon to change. Before we get into that, I want to quickly talk about the rest of the production aircraft as a whole in their own section, and then focus on their service history, just because the chronology of things will get a bit confusing otherwise. So, early production aircraft of the 189A series were very similar to the V4 prototype, though they incorporated some aerodynamic refinements to the engine cowlings and an improved undercarriage. Armament was finalized as a pair of forward-firing MG-17s in the wing roots, and for defense there were 2 MG-15s in rear and dorsal positions. 4 bomb racks were installed under the outboard wings, each able to carry the 70-kilo SC-50 bomb. To aid in their use, the GV-219D bomb sight was added for the cockpit, and this would facilitate the use of the bombs in level bombing or dive bombing. Following successful testing, the S-125 smoke generator was also installed, and this proved to be particularly useful in the fluid battlefields of the Eastern Front. In terms of specialized reconnaissance equipment, the A1s could carry RB-50/30, RB-21/18, or RB-20/30 cameras that could be fitted depending on the mission, along with the HK-12.5 or HK-19 handheld cameras that could be stored on board for use by the observer. In its production form, the aircraft now measured 12 meters in length, with a wingspan of 18.4 meters and a height of 13.12 meters. Its loaded weight was 4,169 kilos. Performance was respectable rather than spectacular. It had a top speed of around 350 km per hour, which is around 189 knots, a service ceiling of 7,300 meters, or just under 24,000 feet, and a range of roughly 670 kilometers, or 361 nautical miles. The pre-production aircraft were built at Focke Wulf's factory in Bremen. This plant would soon be heavily occupied with production of the Focke Wulf 190, But as the Luftwaffe leadership gradually came to appreciate the attritional losses on observation aircraft, particularly the older Henschels, the Focke Wulf 189A would be given greater priority. A second production line was therefore later on established at the Aero Avia factory in Czechoslovakia. Production of the Focke Wulf 189 would gradually increase, at least by the standards of reconnaissance aircraft. Despite being inundated by orders that were screaming for more Focke Wulf 190s, the Bremen factory still managed to push out 38 189s in 1940 and 61 the following year. Meanwhile, the Aero factory delivered 151 aircraft by the end of 1941. Captured French factories in Bordeaux would also be used to assemble parts manufactured in the Bremen factory to speed up production overall. These numbers would increase in 1942 to 327 aircraft manufactured in Germany, France, and Czechoslovakia combined, and in 1943 production would be mostly transferred to France, with the Bremen and Prague factories only turning out a handful of aircraft as production shifted wholly towards fighter production, something to do with the hordes of Allied heavy bombers that were beginning to make their presence known over the German homeland. During this same period, the design would continue to evolve though. In mid-1941, the Focke Wulf 189A2 entered production. Its defensive MG-15s were replaced by twin high fire rate MG-81Z machine guns, which gave it a much stronger defensive punch. The A3 was developed as a dual-controlled trainer for the type, and the A4, meanwhile, was adapted for a hybrid reconnaissance and close support role. Its wing root machine guns were replaced with 20mm MG-FF cannons, and extra armor was added beneath the engines, the fuselage, and the fuel tanks. Development would continue with the E-series, which was to have electrically operated landing gear, but be powered by the French-built Gnome 14. These were 14-cylinder radial engines offering around 700 horsepower each. This would have led to substantially increased performance. However, the only prototype crashed during a ferry flight to Germany for evaluation, and following its loss, the idea of a radial Focke Wulf 189 was gradually abandoned. Following on from the E, the F-series was otherwise almost identical to the A-series. The F1 was similar to the A2, and the F2 was only slightly different in that it had increased armor protection and fuel capacity. A final proposed version would be the Focke Wulf 189G, which was to be powered by a pair of massively powerful 950 horsepower Argus AS402 engines. This required a series of structural changes, but was predicted to have a maximum speed of 435 km per hour. However, as the AS402 engines would not enter production before the end of the war, there would be no 189Gs ever built. Production of the Focke Wulf 189 would continue through the war until early 1944. During this run, a total of around 864 Focke Wulf 189s were produced, including prototypes and testbeds. Okay, so that was a quick and brief abridgment of the production series of the Focke Wulf 189. If you want to learn a bit more about the specific variants, I highly recommend you check out the books and sources that I list in the video description down below. So, moving on to the service history. Throughout 1940, most of the work was taken up by the aircraft operated by experimental and training units. Due to the Luftwaffe's inaction on procurement, the type missed out on all of the early campaigns of the war, Poland, Norway, France, and the Battle of Britain, and deliveries didn't appear in sufficient numbers until the beginning of 1941. Though production was ramping up quickly, it wasn't enough to make up for the loss of time, and when Operation Barbarossa kicked off in the summer of 1941, the Henschel 126 was still the primary equipment being used by the short-range reconnaissance units that were supporting the German army, and this would have consequences. Although initial air supremacy was achieved over the front quickly, it wasn't long before the Soviet resistance picked up and losses began to mount. The reconnaissance squadrons in particular would suffer terribly, and now the Luftwaffe's decision to delay production of the Focke Wulf 189 would come back to bite it in the backside. More than 80 Henschel 126s were lost in the opening months, which amounted to just over 10% of all airframes built. These losses could not be easily replaced. Production of the 126 had been terminated at the start of the year, and losses from earlier campaigns, though lighter, had already absorbed much of the airframes that were being held in reserve. Further compounding the problem was the rapidly developing and understandably hostile Russian partisan movement in the German-occupied territories. This forced the reassignment of vital aircraft and further reduced the number of airframes available to frontline reconnaissance units. The situation got so bad that at least 12 reconnaissance squadrons would have to be disbanded due to lack of equipment by the autumn months of 1941. This represented over a third of all short-range recon squadrons that were deployed at the start of the invasion in the summer. The losses came as a shock for Luftwaffe commanders, but they had underestimated the intensity of the air operations over the Eastern Front, and the little Henschels just couldn't cope. Had the Focke Wulf 189 been available in numbers from the start, the situation may have been different. Not because it outperformed the Henschel. Indeed, later models of the Henschel 126 had better speed, climb, and range, but because the Focke Wulf 189 was, by the very nature of its design, more durable. Its twin-engine, twin-boom, cantilever monoplane airframe offers much more resistance to battle damage than the single-engine parasol wing airframe of the Henschel 126. However, we are getting into hypotheticals here, and I'm not here to discuss what-ifs or how-maybes. The point is, the 189 had not arrived on time or in sufficient numbers. By winter, the Wehrmacht reconnaissance operations were in complete shambles. As losses continued to mount, observers, now without spare planes to operate in, were retrained as pilots to operate reconnaissance variants of the Bf-109. Although this should have presented the Soviets with a harder target to destroy, the rushed nature of the training, combined with rapidly degrading weather conditions, meant that the loss rates actually increased. But change was afoot. On December the 8th, 1941, senior members of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe initiated a significant reorganization plan. A big change was the shift from independent reconnaissance squadrons, operating under Luftwaffe orders, to structured reconnaissance groups which assigned their squadrons to ground units and reported directly to the unit commanders. And it was into these reorganized units, further reduced by winter attrition, Soviet counterattacks, and supply shortages, that the Focke Wulf 189 would finally begin to arrive in sufficient numbers to be deemed useful. By spring of 1942, German counterattacks and the spring thaw had relieved the worst of the pressure, buying some time for the battered recon units to replace men and materials. Once the Focke Wulf 189 began to reach the frontline units and enter operation, it quickly earned an excellent reputation among the Luftwaffe crews, both in the air and on the ground. Pilots praised its reliability, its easy handling, and its maneuverability. One of its most valued qualities was the way it combined high stability with good control response, qualities that rarely went hand in hand easily. Ground crews appreciated its relative simplicity and ease of maintenance. The Argus engines, for their part, were considered dependable and very easy to manage. Better still, if one engine failed, the aircraft could still fly quite safely on the other. But perhaps best of all, and despite its somewhat dainty appearance, the whole airframe proved to be remarkably durable. To give an example, in one incident, on the 19th of May 1942, a pair of MiG-3s intercepted a Focke Wulf 189 at an altitude of around 4,000 meters above the Taman Peninsula. Both MiGs were able to inflict heavy damage on the Focke Wulf 189. The port engine was disabled, and the boom that it was mounted on received so much damage that the crippled engine actually fell free. Along with this, the canopy was severely damaged and both defensive guns were put out of action. Luckily for the crew, The MiG fighters broke off, possibly believing that the 189 was crippled and had no hope of survival. But survive it did, limping back to a forward airfield where it managed to roughly survive a crash landing. The port landing gear collapsed, causing yet more damage to the already mangled port wing, but despite all of this aircraft was still salvageable, and after lengthy repairs it was eventually returned to service. By the summer of 1942, the Focke Wulf 189s were beginning to appear over the Eastern Front in ever-growing numbers. Soviet reports from the Karelian Front still described them in slightly vague terms, but before long there was no confusion about what they were and their purpose. More and more often, the Focke Wulf 189 was the aircraft carrying out frontline reconnaissance for the German army, and its presence became increasingly familiar to Soviet troops below. Around Stalingrad, for example, Soviet accounts described them as practically hanging over their forward positions. Over Kurgan, they appeared as often as 5 or 6 times a day at intervals of just a couple of hours. More often than not, each of these reconnaissance flights was then followed by a dive bomber strike, so they became quite unpopular with the Soviet troops rather quickly. However, the aircraft was of course not invulnerable, and the Soviets quickly caught on to both its significance and its weaknesses. As the war went on, Soviet pilots gradually learned how to intercept and destroy it, and the Battle of Stalingrad would see a renewed surge in losses for reconnaissance squadrons. Indeed, by the battle's conclusion, the average short-range reconnaissance unit of the German army had lost nearly 25% of their aircraft and crews. Many of these losses occurred in the air, either from air-to-air combat or damage or losses from ground fire, but some came directly from ground action. When the Soviet counterattack came, many forward airfields were overrun with such speed that many aircraft were either destroyed or captured on the ground. But even as some Focke Wulf 189 units were actively being overrun and captured, others continued to operate, even after the German 6th Army was completely surrounded. Even with escorts, the observation aircraft were now priority targets for their Soviet opponents, who were becoming incredibly determined to knock them out of the sky. In one incident on the 17th of December 1942, a Focke Wulf 189 with tail number 5HKK was engaged by Ivan Maximenko and his wingman Chimbarev. During the attack, Chimbarev ran out of ammunition, but this did not stop him. Adhering to the now age-old tradition of, "Comrade, if you have no bullets, you are the bullet," he proceeded to ram the 189, cleaving off its tailplane with his propeller. This would not be the only ramming incident involving Soviet pilots, but it serves to deliver the point that I'm trying to make. By February of 1943, the fighting around Stalingrad had cost the Luftwaffe 150 short-range reconnaissance aircraft. Most of these were Focke Wulf 189s. These losses now revealed an uncomfortable truth. Although the Focke Wulf 189 was more survivable than the old Henschel 126, it could only operate effectively when the Luftwaffe enjoyed at least some control of the air. Once that condition disappeared, even a very good reconnaissance aircraft began to look alarmingly vulnerable. Following Stalingrad, some units were reorganized once again owing to a lack of aircraft in reserve, and several would be converted onto other airframes such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, or reconnaissance versions of the Bf-110, or even the Focke Wulf 190 A3 or A4 series. For the remaining twin-engined Focke Wulfs, new tactics had to be developed. Greater emphasis was now placed on deception, surprise, and close familiarity with the terrain. A report from the North Caucasus Front in March of 1943 noted that Focke Wulf 189s sometimes lured Soviet patrol fighters into positions where they could be pounced upon by superior numbers of Bf-109s and 110s. Crews also spent considerable time studying their assigned sectors before operations began. Reinforcement units might spend 10 days or more simply learning the local geography, and each detachment typically flew within a very narrow and carefully rehearsed area along well-known and plotted routes. This planning was beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, it obviously meant that there was a much lower chance of the crews getting disorientated and lost in missions where they encounter sudden combat. And two, and more specifically to the point, studying a narrow approach corridor meant that you could fly that corridor a lot more aggressively, let's say. A lot of these reconnaissance flights would spend a lot of time at incredibly low altitude before getting up to their operating altitude. So a Focke Wulf 189 units would take off from their forward airbase, fly at treetop height as long as they could, masking themselves in the terrain as well as they could, considering how flat Russia is, and only when they were approaching the area they were meant to be observing would they climb up to an appropriate altitude to do so. This was, of course, something of a high-risk and high-reward strategy, as if you're flying very low to the ground, you are a lot closer to the enemy ground units that can shoot up at you. However, on the whole, the losses from these lower altitude missions were of a lower rate than what they were operating with before, and although the tactic was not officially written into doctrine or policy, many Focke Wulf 189 units would use this tactic moving forward. 1943 was definitely a year of ups and downs for the Focke Wulf 189, which saw both of its strengths and weaknesses further highlighted as the situation began to get rapidly worse for the German army. During May 1943, some Focke Wulf 189s began to be reassigned, with some units being pulled far away from the front and used instead against Soviet partisan activity in the occupied territories. The fantastic visibility offered by the 189, combined with its ability to cruise at relatively low speeds, proved ideal for spotting the heavily camouflaged staging areas, camps, and various stores of the partisan units, and the Focke Wulf 189's armament, which was now being considered too light for use on the front lines, was still more than sufficient to engage these lighter units in the occupied territories. However, on the whole, 1943 would see a gradual decline for the type. Despite its best efforts, the odds were getting stacked against it by this point in the war. The next major challenge for the 189 came with Operation Citadel and the Battle of Kursk. During this, reconnaissance aircraft were operated continuously to track Soviet positions. During this fighting, French pilots would score their first victories against the 189. This was the French Normandy Niemen unit, which piloted Yak fighter aircraft in support of the Soviets, and they supposedly claimed the downing of at least 3 Focke Wulf 189s. This was a period that saw a lot of activity for the reconnaissance units. Unfortunately, the specific use of the 189 in Operation Citadel is not particularly well documented. But it is stated that even after the German attacks stalled, reconnaissance units continued to operate and were able to identify and warn of the locations of the coming Soviet counterattacks. Unfortunately, even with the advance warning, there was pretty much little that the exhausted German forces could do at this point, as they had no reserves left to stem the oncoming tide. It was now becoming increasingly dangerous to be a Focke Wulf 189 aircrew. Ever-growing numbers of Soviet fighters forced the 189s to try crossing the front lines at ever lower altitudes to attempt to remain undetected, but this was now only having limited success as the Soviets had grown wise to their low-altitude tactics. For long periods of time, German reconnaissance was effectively halted due to the increasing enemy air and ground threats, and adding to the issues of sheer numbers now, the introduction of the Lavochkin LA-5 posed a new problem for the aircrews of the Focke Wulf 189, and that was friend or foe identification. The radial-engined LA-5 closely resembled the Focke Wulf 189, even at medium and semi-close range. This often led to aircrews and their defensive gunners, obviously, holding their fire on what they assumed to be a friendly aircraft, only realizing when the guns opened up that they had in fact made a fatal mistake. And then, just to make matters even worse, the Soviet summer offensive would also see the arrival of the Yak-3. With its excellent low-level performance posing a new and even greater threat to the low-altitude tactics being employed by the 189 crews, the situation deteriorated somewhat quickly. One solution was to try and deploy even more fighter escorts, which went about as well as you'd expect by this point in the war, and another was the shift to nighttime reconnaissance missions. But these were of limited effectiveness, as air crews rarely deployed the photoflash bombs that were required for nighttime photography, from fear of highlighting themselves to enemy ground forces and night fighters. There was also now another thing working against the Focke Wulf 189, and that was that the Soviets knew everything about it. Dozens of examples had been captured following Stalingrad, and by this point in the war they had been thoroughly assessed. Soviet assessors and test pilots did indeed praise the design, almost as much as the Germans did, noting its good visibility, its ease of maintenance, and flying qualities, especially in poor weather. But at the same time, they pointed out that its weak armor and relatively light caliber defensive guns left it vulnerable not only to fighters, but also to attack aircraft like the Ilyushin IL-2, and, of course, ground-based defensive weapons. In other words, it was good, but it needed air superiority to survive, and by this stage in the war, that was something the Luftwaffe just couldn't provide. From this point on, the situation really could only go downhill. By the summer of 1944, 189s were no longer being used for daytime reconnaissance, even with heavy escorts. They continued to be employed at night as both night fighters and reconnaissance fighters, often being mixed in with units with Bf-109Gs, Focke Wulf 190A4s, and the occasional Bf-110C. In the night fighter role, they were often equipped with flame dampeners, the Focke 212C Liechtenstein air intercept radar, and a fixed upward-firing armament of MG-15 or MG-20 cannons. Most of the time, they were sent off to intercept the slow-moving harassment aircraft, aka the Polikarpov PO-2, which was being used for nighttime attacks purely to stop the German army from essentially being able to go to sleep, hence the term harassment raids. Now, along with serving with the various reconnaissance squadrons of the Luftwaffe, around 50 Focke Wulf 189s also found their way into the hands of Germany's allies. The newly established Slovakian Air Force was the first foreign operator, being outfitted with German equipment so that it could aid in the war effort on the Eastern Front following Operation Barbarossa. 14 would be sent to them in total to equip a tactical reconnaissance squadron, and this unit saw combat in 1942 and 1943, usually in the region of Crimea. In 1944, when the Slovakian uprising broke out, the unit returned to their home bases, and we had the unique situation where some Focke Wulf 189s were being operated in hostile operations against other Focke Wulf 189s, the Slovakian ones against the German ones. German air superiority, though, soon crushed this rebellion, and the 6 surviving Focke Wulf 189s in the rebelling Slovakian hands fled to the Soviet Union with the Slovakian fugitives, and it seems a couple might have been operated by the Soviet forces. However, the documentation on this is incredibly slim. It is known, though, that at least 2 were broken up for parts and assessment during the whole period where the Soviets were pulling the thing apart to see exactly how they could destroy it. Moving on to another allied nation of the Germans, the Royal Romanian Air Force would receive a handful of Focke Wulf 189s as well. This was to replace the IAR-29 and the HS-129 as trainers for the conversion of reconnaissance pilots from single-engine to twin-engine airframes. They didn't see much in the way of service, though. In the summer of 1944, they would begin training for night fighter operations. However, by August, the airfields were being overrun by the advancing Soviet forces, who then captured even more Focke Wulf 189s. The Royal Bulgarian Air Force also received some Focke Wulf 189s. These were sent to active reconnaissance units and would see some action over the Eastern Front in 1943. It was Hungary, though, who would become the largest foreign operator of the 189, starting in the spring of 1943. German High Command decided to upgrade its Allies' Air Force with substantial numbers of modern German aircraft, and the Focke Wulf 189 was to replace the obsolete Heinkel 46 and the Manfred WM-21 that were at the time serving in short-range reconnaissance squadrons. The 189s would be formed into a new Royal Hungarian Home Guard flying squadron. The Hungarians would also bestow the aircraft with a third nickname, this time calling it the Bel Ami after a German film star. The units would serve in both recon and in anti-partisan roles, before being thrust into the Battle of Kursk, where they also performed low-altitude bombing and harassment missions. The Hungarian units saw quite a bit of action. By October 1943, the units had racked up over 1,000 sorties. A pair of notable incidents took place on the 21st of September 1943. The first involved the aircraft of Cornet Sappo, which came under attack by 3 Yak-9s. Though he was heavily outnumbered by vastly superior fighters, his 189 was able to claim the destruction of 2 of the 3. Conducting evasive maneuvers, Sappo dove down to a very low altitude, giving his defensive gunner a chance to shoot down one of the fighters, while another simply crashed into the terrain whilst trying to keep up with Sappo's erratic maneuvers once he got down to treetop height. The second incident on that same day involved Sergeant Sutay's aircraft coming under attack by no less than 6 LA-5s. Somehow, the crew managed to shoot down 2 of the Lavochkin fighters before managing to escape with heavy damage. Though these 2 189 crews were able to defy the odds, many others would not be so lucky. The squadron would eventually succumb to the constant fighting and lack of replacements, and by March of 1944, the sole surviving airframe was recalled to Hungary, and the squadron was disbanded. In the final months of the war, the remaining 189s in German or other foreign service had been entirely replaced in frontline use, but they remained operational until the very end of the war, serving in training squadrons and in liaison units. In these roles, they still took some losses, and the last reported downing of a 189 was on the 8th of May 1945. Unfortunately, the type's post-war record is nebulous at best. Not a great many survived, and most were scrapped pretty early on into the piece. However, one example, Focke Wulf 189A1, Werk number 0173, found itself as the on-again, off-again personal transport for a British naval officer. Now, that officer was Captain Eric Melrose Winkle Brown, commander of number 1426 Flight RAF, better known as Enemy Aircraft Flight, and the most prolific test pilot in his nation's history. Though he never formally tested the 189, he often used it as a hack, a transport, to ferry him between various aerodromes as his unit scurried around the German countryside to vacuum up any vaguely interesting aircraft that they could get their hands on. Brown also got a chance to fly the Blumenvoss BV-141, which was in Soviet hands and due to be scrapped. He distinctly preferred the Focke Wulf 189 out of the 2. Though it wasn't a beauty, Brown described it as being irresistibly seductive because it was so pilot-friendly to fly. Like the German pilots, he praised its stability, particularly at low altitude in turbulent air, but Brown was most impressed by the aircraft's single-engine performance, which he claimed to be of a very high standard. Unfortunately, even Winkle Brown's high praise could not save the 189. Eventually, he delivered it to the Royal Flying Establishment for further testing, and was later saddened to hear that it was destroyed during a severe winter gale. He later described it as a sad end to a likeable friend. Only one Focke Wulf 189 is known to survive as an airframe today, and it's currently in a partially restored state in Britain. Apparently, it was purchased by Paul Allen's Flying Heritage Collection, and for years it was one of the best-kept secrets of the aircraft restoration company at Duxford, but it went up for sale about 5 years ago, and barely a whisper has been heard of it since, so I'm not too sure what the current state of affairs is with this one, but it would be great to see a restored Focke Wulf 189 put up in a museum somewhere one day. If anyone knows anything about its fate, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Although reconnaissance aircraft like the Focke Wulf 189 seldom get the same fame and attention of their fighter or bomber cousins, the impact they made cannot be doubted. By spotting enemy movements, guiding artillery and harassing partisans, a single aircraft can influence a major part of a battle. Perhaps the strongest statement of their effectiveness is in how the enemy reacted when they were encountered. The prioritization of taking down reconnaissance planes over all other types, up to and including ramming them bodily out of the sky, shows that these flying observation posts were a force multiplier of deep importance. The role of reconnaissance aircraft would not expire with the end of the Second World War, and the Cold War would see new designs that could fly faster, further, and much higher than ever before. But those will be some stories for another day.
As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help to keep this channel going. Okay, so by the time this video goes live, I will be at the Pacific Air Show on the Gold Coast, taking lots of photos of amazing aircraft and also helping out as a volunteer with my local air museum. So if you're here this weekend, feel free to say hi if you see me wandering around with a camera or carrying a large collection of second-hand books that are going up for sale. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Guillaume Aubuchon, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly there, who is the newest member of this special group. So part 2 of the Sea Vixen deep dive is in progress. The original plan was to do it as just one massive video, but the script ended up being far too long for me to consider that acceptable, so we decided to split the script up into multiple segments, and my goodness is part 2 a doozy, so I hope you're looking forward to that. It is in production currently. There's also a new aeronautical engineering video in the works as well, which I'm hoping to release towards the end of the month or early September. Anyway, that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued patience and support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.